This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Occupy Wall Street protesters are converging in the financial district in Manhattan today to mark the first anniversary of the movement's beginning. Similar protests are taking place in dozens of cities. On September 17, 2011, thousands of people answered the call originally put out by the Canadian-based magazine Adbusters to occupy Wall Street. Protesters slept in Zuccotti Park for nearly 2 months before the New York police raided the encampment. The September 17th action inspired over 1,000 other Occupy protests and encampments around the world. The Occupy movement is largely credited for reframing the national dialogue on economic inequality and popularizing the phrase, "We are the 99%. We begin today's show looking back at some of Democracy Now!'s earliest coverage of the movement.
I think the purpose of September 17th for many of us who are helping to organize it and people who are coming out is to begin a conversation as citizens, as people affected by this financial system in collapse, as to how we're going to fix it, as to what we're going to do in order to make it work for us again.
On Saturday, thousands of protesters took to the streets of downtown Manhattan for what was described as an action to occupy Wall Street.
I came because I'm upset with the fact that the bailout of Wall Street didn't help any of the people holding mortgages. All the money went to Wall Street and none of it went to Main Street. Now, we've just learned that Geithner was actually asked to split up the Citibank, and he didn't do it, and Obama didn't do anything about it.
The plan wasn't simply for a one-day protest, but an ongoing and creative occupation of the financial district itself. Organizer Lorenzo Serna.
The idea is to have an encampment. Like, this isn't a one-day event. Like, we're hoping that people come prepared to stay as long as they can, and then we're there to support each other.
People have to go into their public squares, meet each other, start talking to each other, and start brainstorming of ideas. I mean, essentially the idea is the system is not going to save us. We're going to have to save ourselves. So we're going to try to get as many people as possible to camp in some public place and start rebuilding society as we'd like to see it.
Well, this weekend, hundreds of people from around the country gathered in New York City to mark the anniversary with 3 days of events. Occupy protesters vowed to stage a number of direct action protests beginning in the financial district this morning. Police began making arrests this morning just before we went to broadcast. Another 50 Occupy protesters were arrested over the weekend. We'll get updates from the streets in a moment, but first, on Sunday, protesters gathered in Foley Square for a concert to remember Occupy's one-year anniversary. They broke out into song and dance when musician Tom Morello took the stage, the former lead guitarist of the band Rage Against the Machine and one of the movement's earliest supporters. Democracy Now! Spoke to Tom Morello and other Occupy participants.
I've been a supporter of Occupy Wall Street almost since its inception. I played here in the first 2 weeks of when it was at Zuccotti Park, came back for the May Day resurgence, and whenever Occupy rears its head, I will be there to support. I think it's up for us to come up with new strategies of action to empower those who felt that first spark, that first radical spark. Because the thing that's, I think, was new and exciting for me as someone who's been an activist for 20 years, who was different about the Occupy movement, was it was a brand new generation of people who had never been involved in any sort of protest or even charity work. Because the corporate malfeasance that caused the global economy to collapse has affected everyone. And the one thing where Occupy has been, I think, tremendously successful is highlighting the grotesque economic inequality that exists in our country and around the world. The dirty 5-letter word class that was considered unutterable until the Occupy movement is now on everyone's lips.
Yeah, my name's Chris Casper, and I'm with Strike Debt. Basically, we're a group that's addressing the problems of debt. Right now, my total student debt is just over $145,000. The traditional political parties don't seem to be offering anything about any kind of debt relief or debt forgiveness unless it's for the banks. Like, nobody's really even talking about it. So one of the things that we've started doing here in Occupy is holding debtors' assemblies. Strike Debt has been holding debtors' assemblies at Washington Square Park. We usually meet on Sundays at noon. And it started with just having assemblies and having people come out and speak out publicly about their debt and sort of like letting go of the shame of the debt.
Ray Abalea with Pro-Pink Women in Peace. Pro-Pink joined up with a coalition of groups marching against the Spectra fracking pipeline here in New York City, and there's a large Occupy protest parade, and we decided to do a bus
International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 103, Boston. There is a class war against the unions. They're the last stronghold between Wall Street, the Wall Street politicians we have, and the 99%. Right now, private sector unions are about 5% of the population. Public sector is about 7%. And they're dismantling public sector. They are after them big time. Wisconsin, Obama never showed up there, never shows up in Chicago last week. There's no difference, really, between these two parties. They're under the influence of big money from Wall Street. I think Occupy Wall Street has got into the narrative, the 99%.
People rallying at Sunday's concert marking the first anniversary of Occupy Wall Street here in New York City. We're going right now to the streets of Lower Manhattan. Allison Kilkenny is there. She's with Citizen Radio and writes for The Nation magazine. Allison, what do you see right now?
Hi, Amy. There are hundreds of people marching in the street. I've witnessed 2 arrests myself. I've seen reports of around 10 more. Including some arrests this morning. I just witnessed a photographer named Julia be arrested. The white shirts, the supervising officers are acting very aggressively, shoving people out of the street. There are officers on mopeds accelerating very quickly, acting aggressively, telling people they'll be arrested if they're walking in the streets. But the protesters aren't deterred yet. There are several factions walking all over Wall Street, just trying to split up the police presence. I'm walking with one right now along South Street. There's probably around 200 people.
And for people watching this broadcast, we're showing the live stream of what's happening downtown Manhattan. Allison, what are people saying right now, and what is the state of Zuccotti Park itself?
I've seen reports that there are around 200 people at Zuccotti as well. More arrests are happening in that area. I was marching with the protesters, and they were chanting anti-capitalism all day, all week, Occupy Wall Street, their usual mantras. They seem really excited to be back in the street and to see each other again. This is the biggest reunion since the height of Occupy last year.
Allison Kilkenny speaking to us from the streets of New York, right near Wall Street. She is co-host of Citizen Radio and writes for The Nation. We're going to break and come back and have a discussion about what happened a year ago and where the Occupy movement is today.